Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on the Enlightenment and knowledge production. Let me begin this session with a quote. So that the work of preceding centuries will not become useless to the centuries to come, and so that our offspring, becoming better instructed, will at the same time become more virtuous and happy, and that we should not die without having rendered a service to the human race in the future years to come. This is a quote by Denis Diderot, prominent Enlightenment thinker and co-founder of and contributor to the Encyclopédie, a general encyclopedia published in France between 1751 and 1772, and it also opens the preamble of Wikimedia Deutschland's charter. But is the Enlightenment still a valid and fruitful point of reference? It's often celebrated as a period of intellectual progress, as the birth of modernity, but it is crucial to critically examine its ambiguous legacy. It's often argued that the era's emphasis on reason, science, and individualism contributed to advancements in knowledge and societal development, but the question must be asked, whose development and on whose back? After all, these concepts have also been used to justify colonialism and imperialism, sexism and racism, and other forms of exclusionary thought and practice. And clearly these thoughts were not mere byproducts of the Enlightenment, they were deeply embedded within the Enlightenment project itself, reflecting a Eurocentric worldview that marginalized and continues to marginalize the knowledge and perspectives of the global South and those deemed underdeveloped. The universalist claims of the Enlightenment often masked exclusionary practices that privilege certain groups while oppressing others. The era's legacy includes not only the promotion of human rights, but also the entrenchment of power structures that continue to perpetuate inequality and injustice. Using the example of Wikipedia, this session here aims to engage in a critical examination of how the Enlightenment continues to shape systems and institutions of knowledge production, and we will interrogate how we can relate to the values and principles of the Enlightenment in a critical and emancipatory way, what post- and decolonial theories teach us about just and inclusive modes of knowledge production, and how Wikipedia as a knowledge platform can contribute to promoting epistemic justice. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Nikita Dhawan holds the chair in political theory and history of ideas at the Technical University Dresden. Her research and teaching focuses on global justice, human rights, democracy, and decolonization. She received the Käthe Leichter Award in 2017 for outstanding achievements in the pursuit of women's and gender studies and in support of the women's movement and the achievement of gender equality. Her publications include Decolonizing Enlightenment, Transnational Justice, Human Rights and Democracy in a Post-Colonial World, published in 2014, and Rescuing the Enlightenment from the Europeans, Critical Theories of Decolonization, which is forthcoming. Thank you very much for being here, and the stage is yours.
Introduction and the invitation to share my work with y'all. What I'm going to present in the next 15 minutes, and that's what's been allotted to me, is a summary of a book that's recently come out in German and will be coming out in English soon. And that's a 450-page book. And usually the talk, when I give this talk and present my arguments, they're at least 45, 50 minutes long. So I'm going to try and squeeze that in 15 minutes. I'm going to talk faster, and I hope you all will listen faster too. So here we go. Now. So I called my little input Normative Nihilism versus Epistemic Delinking, Affirmative Sabotage of the Master's Tools. It's a long title, and I'm going to very quickly break it down. So this is a book written by Susan Neiman in 2019, Learning from the Germans, where she argues that no other country in the world has achieved what Germany has done in terms of coming to terms with its past. And that other countries like US and Great Britain can learn from Germany how, in a certain way, to move forward, one has to address the past. I partly agree with Susan Neiman that indeed Germany has accomplished in addressing its historical crimes, it has accomplished something that is exemplary. And yet, I mean, my first language, for example, is Hindi. And in Hindi, the word for yesterday is the same as the word for tomorrow, kal. It gets even more complicated. The word for day before yesterday is the same as the word for day after tomorrow, parso. So only from the context can you understand whether I'm talking about the past or the future. And Salman Rushdie in one of the novels says, for a people whose words for the future is the same as their word for the past, they don't seem to have a firm grip on time. And my counter-argument is, actually, if you want to be, there are these two words in German, Zukunftsfähigkeit and Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. Future viability and coming to terms with one's past. And my counter-argument is that if you want to be future viable, you have to come to terms with one's past. And although Naiman, and the reason why I start with her book is, talks about how exemplary Germany is, I think there's a very selective reading of one's past. And this problem is not just a European problem, it's also a post-colonial problem. So even as I exercise critique, I will also exercise self-critique. There's this wonderful quote by the Marxist thinker Terry Eagleton, ideologies like bad breath, it's always the others who have it. So yes, I will critique the Europeans, but I will also critique the post-colonial world. So just a little bit on the topic of Enlightenment. As was already pointed out, one of the biggest accomplishments and contributions of Enlightenment was this universal principle of equality and freedom. It was a very, very radical idea, and which is why it's still worthwhile today to talk about in a forum like this about Enlightenment. I mean, a lot of people ask me, why are you still stuck on studying the Enlightenment? These are all dead white men, and why bother with them? And I do think that there is a very radical contribution that Enlightenment makes with this idea. I think it's absolutely mind-blowing to say we are all equal. That differences don't make a difference. This is not self-evident. When they argue, it doesn't matter. The color of your skin, your sexuality, your gender, your religion, there is a fundamental dignity in being human, which cannot be denied. This is an incredible idea of human dignity, of human rights, of equality, of democracy, cosmopolitanism, sovereignty, autonomy, inviolability of certain fundamental entitlements. And yet, as was again pointed out, there is a contradiction in rhetorics and reality. So even as thinkers like Immanuel Kant talk about differences don't make a difference, of course, Kant was deeply anti-Semitic, racist, sexist. He's considered to be a pioneer in raciology. He was not supportive of women having access to university. He never left Königsberg, although he wrote about cosmopolitanism. He recycled a lot of stereotypes in his anthropology lectures, in geography lectures, not only about faraway people, the indigenous populations, black people, Indians, but also Romas and Sintis, populations that had been living in Europe for decades. So for example, one example that I always like to give with Kant is that he says that although he was against the doctrine of polygenicism, that, you know, different races have different origins, at that point, it was very, very radical to argue that all human beings, irrespective of their racial belonging, had the same origin. I mean, this would today be, you know, common sense, but for Kant at that time, this was, Kant believed in monogenicism, and this was really radical. And at the same time, he argued, despite the Romas and Sintis living in Europe for 300 years, he said, oh, they come from the Hindustani race, and there you can see that they cannot be civilized. Yeah? So you see these contradictions, these ambivalences, these inconsistencies in Enlightenment thought. On the one hand, there is this progressive, emancipatory, universalist doctrine of equality, freedom, sovereignty, and at the same time, there is justification for colonialist, fascist, totalitarian doctrines. And this is exactly what Adorno and Horkheimer critique in dialectics of enlightenment. What I particularly like to highlight when I talk about the Enlightenment is this question which is rarely addressed: who financed the Enlightenment? So I was for 6 years in Frankfurt, and my former colleague Jürgen Habermas talks about the achievements of Enlightenment and talks about, you know, coffee houses and salons and reading societies as birthplaces where deliberative democracy emerged, public use of reason. So we could think about, you know, Wikipedia also as a digital public sphere. Or even if you want to be a bit more radical, you can talk about Wikipedia as a digital counter-public sphere, yeah, where it's not only limited to bourgeois white men. This is the classical example of Habermas when he's talking about the coffee houses where European propertied white men came together to deliberate about whether it's justified to use violence during the French Revolution. We could talk about Wikipedia as a counter-public sphere, as a virtual digital counter-public sphere, a transnational digital counter-public sphere, where different interest groups come together to deliberate about not private interests, but public interests. And my question was, if you're talking about coffee houses as the birthplace of enlightenment, where did the coffee come from? Where did the sugar in the coffee come from? Who financed the Enlightenment? And here I like to quote Frantz Fanon, who says Europe is literally a product of its colonies. Now, you might say that, okay, this is what happened 300 years ago, and we live in a world where there's been a fundamental restructuring. We talk about the post-colonial world. I mean, look at me. I'm a citizen of India, one of the biggest democracies in the world. Well, not one of the biggest democracy in the world. I'm speaking to you in English. What's the problem now? And what we see is that there are certain legacies and consequences and continuities of colonialism that continue to shape our economic, political, socio-cultural, epistemic structures. So I just brought a very banal example. This is World Economic Forum, January 2020, Davos. And this is not a critique of these young women. Fridays for Future do a fantastic job. Originally, the photograph looked like this. And what Associated Press did was just cropped out Vanessa Nakate, who's a Ugandan activist, saying that, you know, there was this shadow on her face and the photograph was not quite sharp, and that's why, and then of course later they apologized. But initially the photograph that was circulated around the world was this. So the question that Gayatri Spivak, the post-colonial scholar, poses in Can the Subaltern Speak? Who speaks, who's heard, who's listened to, and whose silence is still relevant. And I'm not trying to subalternize Vanessa Nakate. She's an extremely articulate, extremely well-known activist. But I think this is very instructive because actually, right now in the world, it's one of the most dangerous forms of activism to be a climate activist in the global south. And yet, when we think about the ecological movement, we very often think about Fridays for Future, Last Generation, and other initiatives in the global north. And here we see the asymmetry between who's heard, who speaks, and who's listened to. Let me very quickly move on to the three critiques that come when one engages with some form of resistance and opposition to hegemonic structures and processes of knowledge production. So one critique against post-colonial and decolonial approaches is that if you start critiquing Enlightenment ideas of equality, freedom, human rights, democracy, justice, you will end up in normative nihilism. You'll end up with Boko Haram. Yeah, all Western knowledge is evil, and that this will lead to forfeiture of all emancipatory norms. Yeah? So the turn away from non-Western paradigms and normative order will lead to kind of cultural relativism. So this is the first accusation. The second accusation against particularly post-colonial perspectives interestingly come from the decolonial approach. So these are like, as one says in German, Grabenkämpfer. These are like internal conflicts that are happening within the field where both post-colonial and decolonial approaches are critical of Eurocentrism, but there is also a conflict between these two approaches about what should we do with the legacies of European Enlightenment. And the decolonial scholars, who mostly come from Latin America, and here I'm thinking about people like Walter Mignolo and Ramon Grossfugel, argue that decolonization must be in terms of a very radical epistemic delinking and epistemic disobedience. So basically they say that modernity and enlightenment is so deeply entrenched in colonialism that we have to reject European knowledge paradigms and return to pre-colonial cosmologies, epistemologies, ethics, and aesthetic principles. And they actually accuse scholars like me that we are overly reliant on Kant, Hegel, Marx, Gramsci, Foucault, Derrida. I'm sorry I speak really, really fast, but I have only 7 minutes left. And I have a couple of more points to cover. And I, of course, find the critique very compelling. I understand where this impulse comes from to reject European Enlightenment, to reject this violence that has been done over decades and centuries, marginalization, silencing, devaluation of non-Western forms of approaches to ethics, epistemologies, and aesthetics. And yet, my problem with the decolonial approach is, let's just take the example of language learning. So Mignolo argues we should all stop speaking English, German, Spanish, French, and learn non-Western languages like Quechua and Aymara. Now, the problem is that Quechua and Aymara are oral traditions which were codified. The grammar of these languages were codified by Jesuit priests. So today, if I want to learn Quechua and Aymara, my access to these languages is mediated through the colonizers. The grammar, the books, the textbooks of Quechua and Aymara draw on structures that were written down by the Jesuit priests, and of course Europeanized. So there is no pure, uncontaminated, and that's where this idea of master's tools. This very famous line by Audre Lorde, you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, which is a kind of a rejection of Eurocentrism and androcentrism. The challenge here is there is no unmediated access to pre-colonial forms of knowledge systems, that somehow we are stuck with these contaminated structures and paradigms. So just to illustrate this point about, we are caught between normative nihilism on the one hand, critique of enlightenment, rejection of enlightenment will lead to forfeiture of emancipatory goals, and partly post-colonial theory is critiqued because of the impact and influence of French post-structuralism, but also interestingly, so I just mentioned it, 6 years in Frankfurt, and very often post-colonial critique was also, post-colonial paradigms and approaches were also critiqued for influence of first-generation Frankfurt schools. So we were also accused of reading too much Adorno and Horkheimer and dialectics of enlightenment for the rejection and critique of enlightenment. And then, of course, the critique that if you, start challenging Kant and other European scholars, you end up being, end up in censorship, cancel culture, wokeism. This is another accusation against post-colonial studies. So I brought a little anecdote. This is the translation of the 3 critiques of Kant, and there was a disclaimer put by the American publisher, which says that this book is a product of its time and does not reflect the same values as it would if it were written today. Parents might wish to discuss with their children how views on race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and interpersonal relations have changed since this book was written before allowing them to read this classic work. So very often post-colonial critique is given as an example of, oh, this is how you're going to end. Wokeism, cancel culture, you all want to, whitewash, or, well, whitewash might not be the appropriate term here, but you want to just kind of, censor other forms of knowledge systems. And this is the accusation of post-colonial Eurocentrism, over-reliance on the European canon, and that actually we need to find a way out from these 2 positions of normative nihilism or post-colonial Eurocentrism. Another, this is my last point, the more recent accusation against post-colonial, decolonial approaches is that it's anti-Semitic. So I just brought one little example. This was on 13th of October. Christopher Rufo, who's considered one of the pioneers of right-wing ideology. We don't say tweet anymore. So he posted on X this particular quote, conservatives need to create a strong association between Hamas, Black Lives Matter, Democratic Socialist Alliance, and academic decolonization in the public mind. Connect the dots, then attack, delegitimize, and discredit. Make the center left disavow them. Make them political untouchables. So the very term decolonization has, I mean, there is a systematic effort to make it into a term to be associated with academic terrorism. That somehow, this is not just only censorship and wokeism, this is much more violent than that. And I'd be happy to elaborate on that. I'd like to end with the post-colonial conundrums vis-a-vis Europe, European Enlightenment, and these universal ideas. So for decades, post-colonial scholars, particularly here I'm thinking about Taylor's third world approaches to international law, have critiqued human rights discourses. And you know, the universal promise of human rights, saying this is all Eurocentrism, the very idea of human is Eurocentric, slavery was justified in the name of humanism, humanitarianism, and of course, non-Western groups and populations were never considered human. The very idea of rights is Eurocentric. In non-Western cultures, one talks about responsibilities in contrast to rights. And ironically, it is now the post-colonial world which is mobilizing the idea of human rights and universality of human rights. So it was South Africa that took Israel to the International Court of Justice. It was Nicaragua that took Germany to the International Court of Justice, accusing them of complicity in genocide. So here are the conundrums, and which is why I spoke in the title about affirmative sabotage of the master's tools. It's a concept given to us by Gayatri Spivak. So for me, the Enlightenment is somehow like pharmakon. And the Greek word pharmakon is both poison and medicine. Something which can be a curse or a blessing. Something that can kill you, but can also cure you. And I'm very happy to apply this concept not only just to Enlightenment, but the legacies of Enlightenment also. Whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about social media platforms, Wikipedia, or any other, whether we're talking about norms like human rights, concepts like democracy, they can be both poison, they can be mobilized to justify authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, but they can also function as medicine, as counterpoison, to somehow inspire emancipatory and progressive politics. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. And we'll proceed with our next speaker, Kelly Foster. Kelly Foster edits Wikipedias. She's a public historian, researcher, and knowledge justice advocate. Her work is centered around Black digital practice and community and independent archives. Currently, she is the Knowledge Equity Associate at the Train Research Center, University of the Arts London, and an Elsa Gouveia Visiting Fellow in the History Department at Goldsmiths, University of London. The stage is yours, Kelly.
Right, so thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to try and set up my clock, because I have no idea how long 15 minutes is. So we shall see. Every slide will be a surprise. So my name's Kelly, and I'm the poor person that has to follow Nikita. And and hopefully I've got something useful to contribute. But we shall see. And where does this go? Wrong button. Oh, here's the wrong button. Oh no. Oh. Okay, right. So, in my trying to struggle through the Enlightenment and the question that we have today, I went to my kind of schoolgirl understanding of the Enlightenment. And if you went to school in the UK, like me, and you do the Enlightenment history, it often falls back to this is my abiding, my memory in school. And this is a painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, a very famous painting that's in the National Gallery, an experiment of the bird in the air pump. And you have this kind of provincial scientist doing this experiment with a very exotic rare bird, a cockatiel. And this was completed in 1768, so around the same time as the Diderot Encyclopedia. And so for many of us, thinking about the Enlightenment, this is what I imagine most of the time. Let's see if I can go the right direction. But what happens if we use a different painting as my kind of visual framework for what the Enlightenment is, or how and what it meant in the UK and the British world beyond the islands of the Northern Atlantic archipelago? These are the same image. The one on the left is the original. This is a portrait of a man called Francis Williams. This was completed in 1760 in that same window when the Diderot Encyclopedia was being completed. Francis Williams was from Jamaica. He was born to free black parents in Jamaica, and he became a polymath, an astronomer, a poet as well. He was a very rare example of a free African Jamaican person. He was also an aspiring gentleman, which is why he is pictured here, surrounded by his books, his astronomical and scientific implements, and in the dress of a European gentleman. He thought of himself as a learned mind, and in fact he studied in the UK. He studied for a while at Oxford University. He was refused entry to membership to the Royal Society on account of his complexion, is what the record says. But Francis Williams was also a landowner, and what comes along with being a landowner in Jamaica in this period was to also own enslaved people as well. This painting was actually purchased by the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1928. Purchased not for the subject, not for the artistic qualities, but because the V&A was interested in the mahogany furniture that was included in the painting. So it was purchased initially as evidence of this colonial period furniture. It was originally in the collection of a man called Edward Long. Edward Long was a white Englishman who was born in Jamaica. He was a major enslaver and planter, also in Jamaica. And like Francis Williams, he had this aspiration to think of himself as a gentleman of the Enlightenment world. Edward Long, when he returned to Jamaica in the 1820s, set about writing Jamaica from the periphery into the center of the British world by making the argument that Jamaica was a land that was ready to be exploited. And it was Edward Long who also was integral in the British world in making the arguments around race, and especially the racialization of the masses, the African masses that had been trafficked to Jamaica over the past 4 centuries or 3 centuries. His work, The History of Jamaica, sets whiteness as the norm for British colonies. And he also argued that the enslaved were somewhere between human and animal. They were most definitely, in his eyes, subhuman. As I mentioned, this painting was actually in the collection of Edward Long. And his book also, he used it also to degrade and denigrate the work of Francis Williams. He made the argument that a man like Francis Williams was only possible because he was mimicking the European. And it's easy to imagine that at the time that he was writing this about Francis Williams, he was perhaps looking at this painting. In the background of the painting, we have the landscape of the Caribbean island of Jamaica. And where Francis Williams lived, in the parish of St. Catherine, was where my family's from. So the little girl on the left with the bow in her hair is my mum with my family, and that's my mum 40 years later, who is the second from the right. I grew up in London. My grandparents were part of the wave of migration from the former British colonies of the Caribbean, or the still colonies of the Caribbean at that point in time, to the UK after World War II. And It was in the atmosphere of my grandparents' house. That's me, wasn't I adorable? In the atmosphere of my grandparents' house, where I would entertain myself as an only child with these 2 or 3 copies of Reader's Digest Encyclopedia. And it's easy to forget nowadays when we think about the ubiquity of Wikipedia, how encyclopedias were very much a status symbol for the aspirant classes of people like my grandparents were. They didn't quite stretch to Encyclopedia Britannica that could be found in our library, but they did have these very affordable Reader's Digest copies, and I would leaf through these when I was bored. As I said, I was an only child, so I was bored a lot. And it's easy to kind of, or maybe I remember encyclopedia salesman jokes, for example. In our case, in our family, those encyclopedias and other books that were purchased on layaway, bit by bit from the salesman, were stored in a glass-fronted cabinet along with the very treasured hi-fi in a Jamaican family. So this is a small entry in that Reader's Digest Encyclopedia for Jamaica. It says nothing about the people of Jamaica, the 92% of people that had African ancestry. So whilst we think about this, let me just get us to think a little bit about Denis Diderot's encyclopedia and a few things that it's important to remind us about. This wasn't the beginning of encyclopediaism. It's just the one that we see as a flagship for the Enlightenment period. The Diderot Encyclopedia was actually intended to be a work of translation from an English encyclopedia. But there had been encyclopediaism earlier, the Chinese in the 3rd century, India around 1,000 years before that, and also in the medieval period, there was a spurt in encyclopediaism in the Arabic-speaking world. So even though we focus very much on the really revolutionary nature of the Denis Diderot Encyclopedia, it's important to remember that there are these other places of inspiration that we can look to. I was reading a little bit about the development and the printing of the Diderot work, and it makes for a lot of entertaining. There was subterfuge, corporate espionage, ink theft at one point in time, and of course government suppression, all trying to prevent what would be seen as a really revolutionary and reordering of the world that the encyclopedia was suggesting. They aimed, as I understand it, to get the maximum amount of knowledge to the maximum amount of readers. But it's important for us to reflect on the expense of that encyclopedia. And also, it was the workers, I think, as Nikita was reminding us, the workers who made that encyclopedia possible, the rag pickers whose work would have gone into making the paper, the olive workers whose work would have gone into creating the ink, were unable to afford to even consult those encyclopedias at the time. So to think a little bit about a counter-encyclopedia movement, this is a picture that I often use to remind myself as a kind of visual identifier of the knowledge that isn't present very often. This is a painting by a French artist of Brazil. He was traveling in Brazil in the 1820s. It's called The Blacks of the Naturalist. And you can see here coming out of the forest all of these Afro-Brazilian people laden with the specimens that are likely on their way to European museums and universities. What is invisible once these specimens are in European universities and museums is the knowledge of the indigenous people that went into identifying these things and hunting them and tracking them down, and also the knowledge of these African descended people from Brazil as well. All of those are now invisible in how we think about the discovery, in inverted commas, of these animals and of the natural world. So the words there read no humans involved, and it's a reminder for me about a paper written by Sylvia Winter, a Jamaican scholar. She refused to call herself a philosopher. That was written in the aftermath of the attack in Los Angeles. And the Los Angeles police force was using this acronym, NHI, to speak about police brutality, particularly against black and brown people. They said that there were no humans involved in these incidents. For Winter, and this was a reminder of the legacy of these ideas of categorization and classification that was implanted in the Enlightenment period. Nikita was reminding us about the revolutionary idea that all people, all men usually, were created equal. But, you know, oftentimes as it happens, some are just more equal than others. And oftentimes the least equal of all are those who are racialized as black. Sylvia Wynter reminded us that the subjugation of conquered people could be ensured by the pen and by the printing press as well. This is the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is the 1911 example, seen as a pinnacle of encyclopediaism. And when it was, when Wikipedia was being born, so to speak, 22 or so years ago, it was in the public domain. So this was used as kind of one of the main corpuses of public domain work to build this new digital encyclopedia that anybody could edit. This is the entry for the word Negro. And I've just taken an excerpt out of it here. This was written by a man called Thomas Attell Joyce, who at the time was the keeper of ethnography, I think, at the British Museum in London. And much of this article is written into inscribing the inferiority of people who are racialized as black. I've peppered the rest of this with quotes from Caribbean scholars. And this is a useful, A, because you may be less familiar with them, but also it's a useful reminder to me to speak about these things. And we may speak a little bit about the revolutionary nature of the Haitian Revolution to reorder the world. But this is Anthony Bogues reminding us that they reversed the order of human knowledge and what a human was and was not happened with the successes of the Haitian Revolution. So at the time in 1911, when the Encyclopedia Britannica article was published, the great scholar, African-American scholar, W.E. Du Bois, called it ridiculous, the racism in that article ridiculous. And he was at the forefront of a significant encyclopedia movement happening amongst African-American people. So here are some examples of different encyclopedia movements. I've set them very usefully in chronological order. Two of the most famous that you might be familiar with are Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson would be the founder of Negro History Month that would eventually become Black History Month. And of course, W.E.B. Du Bois's several attempts to start what he called the Encyclopedia Africana. And that is, he would never complete that particular project. Eventually, in his old age, he was invited to Ghana by the new president of the newly independent Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, to complete his project. And he, in fact, died in Ghana, a Ghanaian citizen, not a citizen of the United States, but without completing his project. And 30 years later, these three very handsome students at Cambridge University decided that they wanted to attempt to complete W.E.B. Du Bois's project. They decided that, or made that decision, that commitment over an Indian mill in Cambridge. They are postgrad and undergrad students at the time. This is them as older men. Henry Louis Gates Jr., Kwame Anthony Appiah, and Wole Soyinka. And they would be the editors and the publishers of what would be the Encyclopedia Africana, the first version of which was published as CD-ROM. And a print version will come out later. And it was initially $1 million or $1 million grant from Microsoft that led to the publishing of the Africana in Carter, if you can remember CD-ROMs. And it's still not in print, but it's still in progress today. It's being published by Oxford University Press, but only as a digital resource. In the background of this one is a artwork by a Bahamian conceptual artist called Tavares Strawn. The Encyclopedia of Invisibility. And actually this was an installation at an exhibition in London last year, which coincidentally was called There Is a Light Somewhere. And the Encyclopedia of Invisibility was his attempt to create both a work of literature and a work of sculpture, and to speak about the invisibility, the erasure, and the ignored nature of the histories, especially of African and African-descended people. And it's a reminder for me about the promise of the Enlightenment of ordering and reordering the world. And Strawn's attempts to kind of disorder that particular installation is a kind of useful representation of what happens when we think about disorder and how that remakes the world as we understand it. We have here another useful reminder, this time from the Barbadian poet and writer George Lamming, reminding us that a name is an infinite source of power. And who gets to do that naming is often something that we could do with reflecting on. The aim for the Encyclopedia Britannica was to create the sum of all human knowledge. And this is also one of the goals of the Wikimedia movement. There should be a question mark on there as well, because what does this assume? This assumes that we have the rights, we, the Wikipedia movement, have the rights to use the sum of all human knowledge, to access it, to extract it, to be able to gain it, to share it with the world. And that is a really kind of libertarian perspective, a perspective that disregards sovereignty, that disregards power dynamics involved in that. The background of this is a museum case at the London Museum of Docklands, and you can see, well, maybe you won't be able to see, but on the label just under the writing it says, exhibition temporarily removed, and the reason given for removal is the return to the owner. This was, or what was in this case, was a pipe owned by a man called Joseph Shotoye, who was the leader of the Black Caribs in the island of St. Vincent. When he was killed by the British during the Carib Wars of the 1790s, his pipe was taken as a trophy of war by the corporate forces that were involved in that war, and it was on display in the Museum of Docklands up until last year. It's been returned to the government of St. Vincent. And finally, just a reminder, it's all reminders for me as well as for you. This is W.B. Du Bois talking about the unfinished nature of writing an encyclopedia. And this is kind of how I think about Wikipedia. I think we're going to have an opportunity to discuss and to trouble and to unsettle some of our assumptions about encyclopediaism and the Enlightenment and Wikipedia as well. But it's also a useful reminder to that this is an unfinished project, and it's a project that is also unformed as well, or still able to be formed. Even though there are kind of entrenched ideas, especially around the bureaucracy of Wikipedia, there is also the possibilities of doing things differently in different ways, and perhaps also in different places. I think that's me, yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly. You talked a lot about visibility and invisibility, and if I understand correctly, our next speaker is going to talk about other sensoria as well with which to mediate and interact with knowledge and cultural heritage. So next up we have meLê Yamomo. He's an assistant professor of new dramaturgies, media cultures, artistic research, and decoloniality at the University of Amsterdam, a member of the Amsterdam Young Academy and author of Sounding Modernities, published in 2018. He's the project leader and principal investigator of the EU Joint Programming Initiative on Cultural Heritage Project, Decolonizing Southeast Asian Archives, and the Dutch Research Council project Sonic Entanglements. He's also a resident artist at Theater Ballhaus Nauninstraße in Berlin, where his creations echoing Europe, Sonus, and Forces of Overtones are on repertoire. In his works as artist-scholar, meLê engages the topics of sonic migrations, queer aesthetics, and post- and decolonial acoustemologies. meLê, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Jan David. It is on, right? Yeah. I will sit here. I think, there you go. I'll just sit here. And I also invite anyone who might be too far, if you'd like to come closer, then we're a little bit closer. I start with this image. Maybe speak about this, but at the same time, I wanted to keep my talk short so that there will be plenty of time for us to have a conversation. But there were a few notes that I've added to kind of say today. In particular, because I wanted to, I want to reveal some of the processes of how I am thinking and connecting the work that I do with my artistic practice. So this is an image of a scene from Echoing Europe. premiered in 2019 and is in repertoire at Ballhaus Naunenstrasse, so it still comes back every now and then, depending on the theater season. On the back, there is a postcard from 1910 of a Kalinga person on the right, and there's a gramophone in the middle, and it is not very clear to me this person on the left, who is in uniform, certainly a white man, but kind of behind the gramophone. It is not very clear whether he is recording or making the indigenous person listen to what is being recorded. And this is a particular moment where I copied the exact scenario on the postcard on stage with a friend of mine who is also playing a particular role in this scene, where we replicate the exact scenario. Because one of the things that I have been reflecting on my role as somebody who grew up in a former context of colony, perhaps a new colonial space in the Philippines, having moved to Europe, been living here for 17 years, has been educated here, and as strangely this act of like talking about CVs, thank you for reciting my CV, kind of like showing or kind of revealing that much of my knowledge practice and aesthetic practice has been acquired and is happening in Europe, in academies, in institutions, on the stages, theaters, and concert halls of Europe, giving me privilege, you know. But I ask the question, despite the background that I have, to what extent am I not replicating the very behavior of colonialism, of extracting knowledge from somewhere else and bringing it to the metropolis to be able to produce knowledge, aesthetic products that will never go back to the source community and gain capital, economic, cultural, social. So to what extent even I, as I sit here, replicating exactly that behavior? There are many ways that I could answer this, and this, I think, remains something that I bring on when I teach, when I'm performing. But here I also ask a particular, we spoke about Gayatri Spivak, but there's also another question that comes to mind particularly when I show this image, thinking about what I have earlier said, also in my performance. Gayatri Spivak asks the question, can the subaltern speak? And I mean, is there anyone still subaltern in the 21st century? Because subaltern has a particular meaning, and it's not just the colonized, but it refers to a particular group of people who are, in 19th century Philippines, it would have been the Indio, who are at the very, very low rung of the colonial order, both in race and in social class. No? But having said that, so the question, can the subaltern speak? And you know, if we go through, it's a very complex text, a philosophical text, but let's say the shortcut to this question, in Spivak's reflection and philosophical musing, is that her answer is no, because it has to do with a relationality. Because if we can, maybe it's also the other way around. It's not just speaking, but hearing. If we can hear the subaltern speak, then most probably the subaltern is not subaltern anymore because they have been colonized, so they now speak the language of the empire. So they do not constitute as subaltern anymore. And therefore, is this my role? Is my role engaging with my source community part of the colonial process? Do I want that knowledge to become legible into the imperial order? And by doing so, I become part of this construction of knowledge becoming legible and visible, and therefore imperializing that knowledge into a bigger system. That's point one. I go to point two, and this is the thing that I've been reflecting on as Nikita and Kelly has been speaking, and I just want to add maybe just some threads, not necessarily a point, and I want to keep this short, not a constructed, fully constructed thought, but the way that I situate my thinking. I think there are ways, to me, what I'm drawing out here is a relationality, and I also will go back to what I spoken about earlier in my lecture about the triangulation. I will come back to that, the sound, the sonus, and the body. But let me point out how I also see myself in the long history of philosophy and where we are now in the knowledge production. And I think there's a line here that I want to point out, and right in the middle somewhere there, indeed, is Kant, who argues for and who is building up an argument, no? And also somewhere along those lines, in this period of the rise of German philosophy, but also French philosophy, is René Descartes' cogito ergo sum, that I think, therefore I am. And this is also part of the question that I am having here, that is knowledge, the us knowing, and our agency constructing that knowledge so that we could create a subjectivity also imprisons us to our own objectivity. So as I construct the me, the queer, brown artist standing here, as I even say those words to create my subjectivity, have I not also just created my objectivity in this knowledge production? And that is also what I'm pointing out, that it is always a relationship. So I quickly go through some of this thinking that I'm saying, that I think there are two lines here. The one that is coming from Plato that connects to Kant, who thinks that knowledge, and for that matter, beauty and what is good and what is true, is in a different realm. It exists somewhere else. It is not here. In fact, for Plato, this is a bad copy of a chair. A real chair exists in a realm that is always better, that is in its pure form, that we are only copying, that we are just constructing, and it's every copy that we do is a bad copy. And I think, it is in this same line that Kant would build his argumentation that that something that is good exists outside of us in another realm. And I think there is a line that I want to trace as well in this bigger conference that we're talking about, who owns free knowledge. I want to play it a little bit of what is free and what is knowledge in the who, in saying, for example, from the same line that, from the same way of thinking from this Enlightenment, Kant is thinking about the space of the ethics, if this is where we want to find this freedom that is situated in the autonomy. And he's arguing that this autonomy exists in the place of beauty. How? Because he says that if we find something beautiful without any interest in it, and it exists in its pure beauty, there exists autonomy, because we are not connected to it by any need, by any want. But it is through this beauty in its autonomy that we create a place of ethics. It is ethical because it is beautiful without my need for it. And that is also where freedom exists. Yes, but this is also the question that I am asking. This beauty seems to exist again in a different realm. And this is the question that, can we really have an autonomous space where we are now, no? And so I bring in a few, and this is where now I bring in where I am situated. I like this thought. I think this is what is being attacked in us, you know. I like to do this thought experiment with Kant in thinking that we've created universities, we've created this space, an institute, where we should be able to think freely with autonomy, you know, without connecting it immediately to economy, to politics, because that's what this autonomy should give us, this freedom. Because when we ask where is this, what is free in this knowledge, is that it? Is knowledge really in the space of autonomy? What I want to add, of course, as a staunch Marxist, is that Marx brings in something else. He argues that two things: that knowledge has history, and knowledge is a product of labor. Like, unlike Plato, where he argues that knowledge is somewhere else, that we cannot touch, that only geniuses every now and then touches it, and maybe the heavens will open its clouds and then beam it to a brain. Marx argues that everything is historical. It's something that happens through history, and it is done through our labor, that we create things through history. And in a way, there's a connection here that maybe Wikipedia is doing, that that the knowledge that we're producing is the labor of many hands, and it is constantly part of history, that there are ways that you construct it and reconstruct it and reconstruct it. And I think what I also want to add there, as you know, and because there's a problematic to Marx's construction, where he constructs this triangle of the base and all these things. And somewhere in the middle is culture that is producing, that is the byproduct of a superstructure. What is Marx saying? Which is usually the economic structure, the political structure that produces culture. But Stuart Hall, a cultural theorist, argues that no, it is again through our labor that we could reconstruct the superstructure. So it is a relationship. It is through history that our culture can redefine the political and economic structure that where this culture is based on. And for that matter, Audre Lorde also says that indeed, the master's tools, that's what she's arguing, cannot be dismantled by, the master's house cannot be dismantled by the master's tools. There are last two thoughts here that I want to build on. Dana Haraway, who argues for Cyborg Manifesto, is already arguing anyway that, that our bodies are also tools, that we are connected to the medium, we are technological. That we are constant, and I'm going to jump to the last point here to just pull this all together. Judith Butler, who argues that the body is just a body, and a body is a product of history, and a body is a product of labor. Our race, our gender is all historically constructed. We construct our body. Our gender is something that we construct throughout history. You are actively constructing my body right now just by looking at me and listening to me. And this is also where I situate my entire argumentation here, and where my work, I think, both as a thinker and a scholar and as an artist, is that earlier on I created this triangulation of the body and the sound. I think that I was playing out this particular form of European scholarship, that I thought that the body is constant and that the body is constantly producing sound. It produced, Beethoven would produce his symphonies, and that it has a particular sonus, and that if you have the wrong body, then or maybe you have the wrong body and not producing the sonus. This has been the history of musicology, that our bodies are there to produce sound, and that the sound also produces sonus. So this is where I have been thinking my work was, without me realizing that no, actually, the sound is constantly producing my body as well. And my role in this, also as an artist, in this production, not just of production of sound, because I thought my job is just to produce sound, I am constantly complicit to the production of bodies, because I am producing sound. Because we are all interrelated in what we do. I am reproducing gender and race as I produce sound. And so all of this is all interconnected. And there lies this question indeed, that where is this freedom that we're doing? Where is it connected to? Is it me being in Europe having certain autonomy, but where does that freedom, that autonomy, where does that come from? Is it the economy that gives me that freedom? And if you have that freedom, what are you going to do with that? Is it also there to give more freedoms? As we construct these bodies, and I think that's where I am in this whole triangulation. And I just want to go back to say that I realize that the work that I do is that I create sound, because sound to me is labor, and sound is history.
Thank you so much, meLê. You can keep staying. You can stay on stage. I think I would probably sit there, and then you can exactly sit wherever you want. All right, we're gonna go move over to the discussion part of today's session. We'll start, we're a little short on time. We'll do about 20, 25 minutes of talking to each other. I'm gonna ask some questions and you're gonna interact with these questions. And then we're gonna open up the floor to the audience as well. So there's gonna be about, let's say, also 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions from the audience. If you have any questions pop up, try to remember them for that period of time. I think you've all touched on this in your different ways, but I would like to get back to sort of the underlying question that I think brings us here today, which is, how do you think, Nikita, I would ask you first, can we critically engage with Enlightenment in a way that supports rather than undermines contemporary struggles for justice and equality?
Ist das jetzt an? Okay. I think I'll keep it short. I do tend to, speak a lot, so I'll keep it very short. I think we have to become better Kantians than Kant was. I think Kant was a terrible Kantian because he was preaching equality, he was preaching sovereignty, he was preaching freedom, he was preaching solidarity across borders, cosmopolitanism, perpetual peace, and perpetuating at the same time extremely anti-Semitic, racist, sexist ideologies. So I think that somehow, and that's why I provocatively title my work Rescuing the Enlightenment from the Europeans. And the first question, of course, that we need to address is Enlightenment worth rescuing? And the decolonial approach says no. It's so deeply contaminated that it's not worth rescuing. And I disagree there. I think that there is something worthwhile there in ideas of equality, freedom. And of course, these concepts have also origins in other thought structures. It's not that Europeans have, so to speak, copyright on these ideas. So if you take the concept of, say, Weltbürgerrecht, cosmopolitanism, there is this notion in African philosophy, Ubuntu, or Buen Vivir, which comes from indigenous epistemologies and cosmologies in Latin America. So if, there's this work that I've written, this text that I've written called Can Non-Europeans Philosophize? And a very simple response to this question is, of course, there are African philosophies, there are Latin American philosophies, there are Asian schools of thought, and that Europe doesn't have a monopoly. And yet, we have to go beyond just finding equivalences in other languages, vernacular paradigms. So that's one response that to the question of, first, is Enlightenment worth saving? And if the answer is yes, then how do we go about it? And there are various options. Mimicry is one option, that we become better Kantians than Kant was. There is also the option of counter-mimicry, where we say, no, we do the exact opposite. I mean, the title of, I don't know if it's just the title of this session or the entire event, Who Owns Knowledge? Free knowledge. And maybe we should also think about ownership, and maybe think about other ways of relating to knowledge production, which goes beyond ideas of knowledge as property, as intellectual property, and that brings us to commons. So my short response would be that, yes, there are certain concepts and approaches that came from Europe that are worth saving, despite history of colonialism, fascism, totalitarianism, and that it's a laborious task, but I think it's worthwhile.
Kelly, I wonder if you would agree with Nikita's statement, especially as you pointed out the examples of the Encyclopedia Africana. Is that a way of dealing with the Enlightenment values, saving some of it that's worthwhile saving and maybe discarding some other stuff, or how would you define this?
Well, first of all, I thought you were inviting me to disagree with Nikita.
You're also welcome to do that.
I don't know if I'm going to do that. I don't know whether the Encyclopedia Africana would have, I mean, I think Du Bois definitely saw himself as, or was inspired by the Enlightenment ideals. But I don't know whether he would necessarily have spoken about the Encyclopedia Africana as center Enlightenment values. And I think when you follow Du Bois's kind of trajectory over his life and his delinking, to use a phrase that's coming up today, from European philosophies, is quite. He ends his life as an African communist and well, I say delinking, an African communalist. And even though he studied in Berlin as a young man, I don't know if towards the end of his life he would have necessarily have communicated that in the same way. I do think initially when you asked that question and when Nikita was responding to it, I was reflecting on that last slide that Nikita had with Christian Rufo, the architect who delegitimized critical race theory. And I was thinking, actually, what does the Enlightenment need to be saved from? I think, you know, the way that I'm seeing things or reading things is that you know, there is the constant threat of it being co-opted and used or utilized in a way that is that is overtly about oppressing people. So it's I'm not sure whether the Enlightenment needs to be saved, but I'm more interested in kind of thinking about doing work to make sure the Enlightenment is saved from being used as a tool against me and people like me.
Can any one of you think of contemporary examples where you would say the Enlightenment is used in support of emancipatory movements and struggles for justice and equality? Maybe the Encyclopedia Africana is one example, maybe it's not. What do you think are other examples where this sort of holds true, where the Enlightenment is successfully being defended from the Europeans?
Well, again, it's a better Kantian than Ken, I think Nikita put it. And for me, the example of that is the Haitian Revolution, where, you know, the first slave-free society, a revolutionary revolt won by the enslaved people on the island of Quisquia, which is also called Hispaniola. And one of the first things that the Haitian Declaration of Independence did was to declare all the residents of citizens of Haiti black. Well, they did two things. They named the island Haiti, and that was the indigenous name. So they renamed it from San Domingue or Santo Domingo and renamed it the indigenous name of the land. And they declared that everybody, whether they were of African ancestry or not, was black. And that was their way of creating equality, was completely to reject the idea that that to be human was to be white, or to be center whiteness, center Europeanness. And they said that everybody was black. So I think when we look at ways that the Enlightenment has been used, I think we need to think more about what are the ways that it's been countered. And for me, the Haitian Revolution is a useful way to think about that.
Maybe I'll give two quick examples. Is that okay? So one would be, I mentioned earlier that I'm a citizen of the biggest democracy in the world, and the Constitution of India was written by Ambedkar, who came from an untouchable class. And Ambedkar studied at Columbia University, studied with Dewey, and he was a constitutionalist. So he was very inspired by this idea of citizenship and rights. And this, I think, is an excellent example of post-colonial mimicry also. I mean, if you see photographs of Gandhi versus photographs of Ambedkar, Gandhi is doing counter-mimicry. He's wearing his dhoti and, you know, has a Gita in his hand, which is the holy scripture of the Hindus. And Ambedkar's statues are always with the Constitution in his hand, and he has a three-piece suit. And I think this is an excellent example of responses to the imperative to decolonize and different interpretations of what it means to say to decolonize and how differently this idea is coded and decoded. And the other example is, because we've heard so much about Du Bois, there is this wonderful book that's forthcoming by Spivak where she tries to read Gramsci and Du Bois together. And Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist thinker, says everybody is an intellectual, but not everybody has the function of intellectual in society. And that's his definition of subalternity. The inability to exercise intellectual labor. Everybody can think, but not everybody has the possibility to exercise intellectual labor. And this is what Du Bois takes up. So there is this historical fight that happens between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. Booker T. Washington was a black leader, and immediately after the American Revolution and abolition, with slavery being abolished, Booker T. Washington set up the Tuskegee Institute, where black men could quickly be trained as carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and could enter the labor market. Because earning a wage was extremely important for economic independence. And Du Bois rejected this. And he said it's extremely important. Freedom from is not sufficient if you do not have an idea what freedom is for. And for that, you have to, and this is Spivak's interpretation of Du Bois, train the imagination. You have to train people in intellectual, critical intelligence. And here he's inspired by Enlightenment ideas. And Booker T. Washington strongly critiqued Du Bois and said, what do you want us to do? Read Greek philosophy? Read Shakespeare? Think like white men? And Du Bois said, yes. Training in the humanities.
I will add, since we're talking about Du Bois, and I'll try and be quick, and that Du Bois's beef both with Booker T. Washington and with Garvey in the beginning part of the 20th century. To hear Du Bois, who outlives Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, famous Jamaican activist from a very working class background, created the biggest black movement in the world, the Universal Negro Universal Negro Improvement Association. No, I'm getting my letters mixed up, the UNIA. But Garvey and Du Bois had this famous beef as well. They would sling terrible insults in the newspapers against each other. But again, towards the end of his life, I think when Du Bois, is writing to Garvey's widows, and he is thinking back about his relationship with Booker T. Washington, he recants a lot of the things that he thought in his youth. And I think he begins to see the value in both, in all of these things, in all of these different routes to liberation that people might take, that he might have taken as a young person going to Harvard and studying in Berlin, or that a farmer studying studying in Tennessee in Booker T. Washington's institution, or a mariner, a seaman working in Cape Town, and the inspiration that he might have had from Marcus Garvey. And I think Du Bois comes to see the value in all of those different routes to imagine a new way forward, and to imagine yourself as free, which is essentially the task ahead.
Can I still add?
Of course.
Yeah. I think one particular thread in this in Enlightenment that I again want to tug, which I've opened up, is the autonomy, the relationship of knowledge free from institutions, from other social constructions. That is, and why we need to fight for this, particularly in this age and time. When 2 weeks ago we had a strike in the Netherlands because of how the state is impeding with the kind of knowledge that we are producing in the university. And for that matter as well, a lot of, like here in Germany, there are certain current political climate that also censors the kind of discourses that we could talk about. So two examples to think about, like how some of these practices of autonomization of knowledge as an Enlightenment practice remains important. The University of Amsterdam has been 2 years ago, last year as well, was banned to do certain protests on certain topics. But at the same time, used the university as a place also for people who are in the streets. We took it out to the streets and did teach in about history of the Middle East to kind of so that when we make our decisions, this is an informed decision. So that even these spaces, the streets of the university, we could create that autonomy that could be done, because outside of the university, we would be caught. We could even be put to prison for talking about these discourses. And so it is imperative that today we create these institutions. We try, or not these institutions, but we uphold this autonomy of knowledge for knowledge to be a space of autonomy. So parallel to this, I would say, and now I talk about aesthetics, of how the arts, as also that's the same space where we create this autonomy for it to be the ethical space. In the recent theater festival that last year that I've been to in Czech Republic, in Prague, there was a performance of this is not an embassy, which on stage, because it was a 1.5-hour performance, they created the theater stage as a Taiwanese embassy. Because as we know of the two China policy, most of Europe does not recognize Taiwan as a country. So therefore they don't even have embassies here in Europe. So what the theater makers did is that for 1.5 hours during the duration of theater, the Taiwanese embassy exists. And using the autonomy of the arts as a space for that to happen, that they are not illegal, because we still have that legacies of autonomous spaces that we've constructed. And that's also at the end of that play, they said that after we have discussed and allowing us to exist as an embassy in this 1.5 hours, we are now about to close this, but will our embassy live in your heart as we end this theater play? So I'm just thinking about how these legacies may continue, not just metaphorically, but really in that 1.5 hours of this autonomous space and time, it allowed us not just an epistemological construction, but it was ontological on stage.
You speaking about spaces for autonomy inspires me to sort of bridge the gap to talk a bit about Wikipedia. I wonder if you think that Wikipedia is a space for autonomy. You said it could be a digital counterpublic. Do you think Wikipedians are better Kantians than Kant? How does the Wikipedia reflect or challenge Enlightenment principles, and what can be done to maybe address current challenges? Whoever wants to speak on this is welcome.
I've been passed the microphone. Wikipedia is reflective of the world, right? So all of the difficulties, the oppressions of the world is represented in the communities that edit Wikipedia. And the kind of hegemonic order of the world is also reflected in Wikipedia as well. But there are pockets, I think, of autonomy, maybe not autonomy, but pockets of new types of encyclopedias being imagined, let's put it that way. So I'm usually inspired by work being done with indigenous groups in South America and also in Australia, where they're writing encyclopedias in their own language. And for a lot of language activists, to have an encyclopedia written in your mother tongue is really powerful. I think the Welsh language Wikipedia in the UK has a really active group of language activists who have created gender parity, something that English Wikipedia is proving impossible to do, but that's been a priority for them in Wales. And also I'm hugely inspired by the work being done by all of the different user groups across the continent of Africa, in oftentimes refusing to be kind of separated by the ideas of what is MENA and what is sub-Saharan African. They organize as a continent. They're not kind of separated by these arbitrary lines. Very often that gets imposed by kind of European views of Africans. And all of that is controlled and influenced by the fact that the Wikipedia movement, the foundation, is still organized along the lines of nation states. So what does that mean for people who are stateless in how they get access to resources with even, just basic grant resources is difficult. And all of that is reflected, I think, in the governance structure. Still to date, there has been no trustee of the Wikimedia Foundation who's African. There is only one chapter, and for those of you that don't know, chapters are kind of one of the most recognized, or the kind of major recognized organizational structure for the Wikimedia movement. There is only one chapter in Africa, and that is South Africa. When you look at the kind of distribution on the global map of how people are organizing themselves, how the workers, and I think we are workers who organize ourselves to create the encyclopedia, you can see the disparities of our real world reflected in that map as to where the chapters are, where the user groups are, and in turn where those resources are going. So then the reason why I still keep participating is because I see it as as a possibilities. I ascribe to something called Black Digital Practice, which is what a scholar called Jessica Marie Johnson coined, a phrase she coined. And she talks about hacking your way into systems where you were never meant to survive. I think we can often think about not only the systems of the encyclopedia, or the systems of Wikipedia, but also the systems of knowledge itself, where your knowledge is, my knowledge, the knowledge of my people, my family, was never meant to be recognized, was never meant to be seen as equal. But how can I, as an individual, or how can we organize ourselves in order to create space to hack your way in, to use things that perhaps have been resourced by other people, and to think about how do we create new worlds and new worldviews and new orders out of those spaces.
You're free to keep responding, but I can also ask a follow-up question to this. So you've talked about sort of using the master's tools to maybe strive for some sense of equality, or to preserve cultural heritage, or to have your knowledge be inscribed into some form of knowledge platform. But and we've talked about visibility and invisibility and silencing and unsilencing, but there's always a danger in unsilencing, and there's always a danger in making visible. You asked me the question, do we want to inscribe everything? Is that the goal of Wikipedia? Is that the goal of an encyclopedia? Do we even want to capture some of these forms in encyclopedic systems, maybe? In particular, embodied knowledge, is that something that can and should be captured in an encyclopedia, or other forms of knowledge? What are the dangers, and how do we reckon with that?
Got the mic again. So another Caribbean scholar, I will go on quoting Caribbean scholars. Edouard Glissant talks about the right to opacity, the right not to be understood, the right to obfuscate people from seeing you, from the right to be invisible. So there is a tension there, because Wikipedia was essentially created by utopians, techno-utopians, and libertarians, and the idea that we are governed by the laws of intellectual property, that when something is no longer protected by laws that protect intellectual property, it's part of the commons. But it's part of the commons there to be exploited, and I think we can see that especially now as AI is being fueled or populated, trained by Wikipedia. And what does that mean for the resource, the capital that's being created by AI? Where does that go? And in turn, how Meta have abused a corpus, not necessarily what should we say? It's called a shadow library, and we'll talk about it in the shadows, and maybe as a opposite to ideas about enlightenment, what happens when we think about existing in the shadows, existing in an opaque situation as well. I think that's just as valuable. But Meta have abused their access to this shadow library in order to create capital for themselves that is not shared with wider society. But all of these ideas around the right to exclude yourself from these systems, whether it be from international copyright law, or whether it be from, as an author, to exclude yourself from a shadow library. I think the bureaucratic systems of Wikipedia hasn't caught up to how to make sure that whether the individual or the group has their own sovereignty and autonomy to be able to exclude themselves from that. There is incredible work being done with indigenous scholars and practitioners in North America around data sovereignty, and also in Australia and New Zealand as well. But I often think about, you know, what about those who are not part of an indigenous governance structure, like the work that's been done in North America and the work that's been done in Australia and New Zealand? How do you then have sovereignty over your own data, your own knowledge, if you do not have the governance structures in order to governance structures and power, right? It's not only governance. If you do not have the governance structure to protect that sovereignty. And sovereignty is kind of a magical word, right? As we've seen over the past few weeks. It's assuming that you have the power to protect yourself, but any of that can be encroached on with violence or with appropriation. And yeah, so it's currently as it stands, the Wikipedia movement deals with all those things inadequately.
Yeah, maybe two thoughts. Indeed, thank you very much, Kelly. I indeed am even thinking as a very specific example of the queer community in the Philippines that that constantly creates a language that is intended for the queer community. Oftentimes, which is always fun. There's a fascinating grammar and lexicography that emerges every 6 months probably, but the whole intention of that is that so the queer community could speak with each other. And the funny thing is that media is constantly trying to decode it, and as soon as it's decoded, then they are legible. And then they move on to the next grammar, which is always much, much more fun. It becomes suddenly a deconstruction of something, but I think this is the point. It's like, I think there are two sides here. Like, to what extent is, what is this knowledge production? Is it, again, where is it embedded? And what I'm saying as well in this, it's an image here, but I realized it wasn't projected there. Like, as we enact even with this idea of a democratic knowledge practice, where is it based on? Because as we do that, maybe we might end up perpetuating certain violences that by making something legible, we make certain communities vulnerable. And that is, I think, that is what I'm thinking about right now. And also, as well, an empire of sensorium that writing is a particular sensory-based knowledge production that requires a certain technology, that of reading and writing, which is ocular-centric, and it is just one way of representation, and that there are other cultures really that has other ways of knowing. Like in my journey with sound, I didn't realize that some Aboriginal communities in Africa map their way through the wilderness by singing. That it is not a visual way of mapping the world, but it's singing through the world that will disappear. That cannot be that cannot be inscribed anyway in certain technologies. So I think there's those two lines. That makes things inconsistent all the time anyway.
Maybe I'll just keep it very, very short. But this is also very important, I think, post-colonial critique of Eurocentrism, that at the heart of the idea of agency is the speaking subject, the one who's eloquent, articulate, and the mute subject is the one that lacks agency. So this is the normative mapping of the idea of emancipation. And what post-colonial scholars have tried to do is turn this around and talk about hegemonic listening. That how sometimes making visible, making audible can be an act of exercise of dominance instead of an act of, it can be extremely paternalistic to say, oh, we will listen, and this is what Spivak and others have tried to do in Can the Subaltern Speak, that the act of listening is not only an act of hospitality to the voice of the other, to the perspective of the other, but it can be a dominant act. And which is why one speaks about subversive silences. So it turns around this opposition between the powerful speaking subject and the powerless mute subject, and shows that sometimes that which remains invisible, inaccessible, escapes extractivist impulses.
Thank you for all of your thoughts on this. I hope we're not going to have subversive silence now, because this is the Q&A session of this Q&A part of this session, where we open the floor for, let's say, about 12 minutes to the audience, and whoever has a question raises their hands, and we'll pass around a microphone.
Thinking of the time, I will do the 1.5 speed, like Nikita did. And in preparation for this conference, I was looking to more platforms than only Wikipedia. But listening to you three now, I was trying to focus on the question: what is the things that has to be done by Wikipedians in Wikipedia? I think we're on a threshold or thresholds, even for the hegemonial epistemic system, which is the, let's summarize because of time, the Western epistemic thinking, right? So, and of course, it comes out of itself. And let's say the cogito ergo sum. And I think with artificial intelligence, the most interesting thing is that intelligence becomes something which is objectified, and therefore it's not the human anymore. We are the intelligent species. Now we are a species which has certain things, and we are having intelligence is not what makes us human. Cogito is not ergo sum. Cogito is just there. And by redoing this, the hegemonial epistemic system is endangering itself, which is actually good. But then again, of course, thresholds, things become aggressive. We see all the woke thing and all the discussions we have. But I want to stick not to the break, to the build part, because meLê said, when you were talking on the stage and you were asking yourself, is that the right place for me and all this? I was seeing epistemic two systems. I was listening to your intellectual Hall and Butler and I wrote what he said, but I also see a human struggling with finding himself in that. So I was feeling two ways. And the good thing, I'm not a religious person, but good religion or organized culture helps us to even the silent people finding moments to be intellectual. And Krumsky, and then I go on to my question, because Krumsky said the intellectual stuff, and I was at all people are intellectuals, but not all people. All people are Wikipedians, but not all people in society have the function of being Wikipedians. Meaning, when you are a Wikipedian, you have to think about what has to be done in epistemic basis of being Wikipedian, and therefore, the humiliation of mankind. Of course, Freud, mankind, Western understanding of mankind. You know the humiliation of mankind, and that's my question. I think what we need now is the next humiliation of mankind, defined by Freud, first Copernicus, we are not the center of the universe, then Darwin, we are not the top of the evolution, and then Freud, we even cannot manage our own brain, our own head. And the fourth humiliation, and humiliations are good because if you overcome the humiliation, you realize that you missed something from reality before, which now was so transformable that you were angered that somebody told you the humiliation, but humiliation can be freeing. So what do you think? Do you think we have to have a positive humiliation project of the hegemonial epistemic way to make Wikipedia part of the next level of joint epistemic systems? That was a little bit. Does that feel like something you can respond to? A typical
questions?
4 minutes.
We don't have so much.
Okay, let's collect some.
Do you want to respond first?
No, we'll collect a few.
I have another very short question, actually, because when I heard you, I was thinking a lot about the relationship between Enlightenment and the emergence of the sciences and the emergence of the internet, and then the emergence of the Wikipedia. And then I was thinking maybe it's kind of you know, like a loop, like we have a way to allow Enlightenment to emerge by having such a nice interconnected world where knowledge can be exchanged, where communities and individuals can rediscover the ideas that actually also Kant originally had. So I was just wondering, what do you think about this idea that this is kind of a long connection of things as a kind of an optimistic outlook, that we are not so much worried about AI to take it or leave it, or it's more like a kind of development that leads from basically Enlightenment to the internet, back to Enlightenment. Does that make any sense to you? That's my question.
Thank you. And we had a third question in the front row that will, no? Yeah. Kind of.
First, I want to thank all of you for your contributions to the conversation so far. I wanted to try to tease out some of the elements that I think maybe are embedded in these questions and things that you've shared here today. I think it was you, Nikita, who mentioned that maybe we need to be talking about ownership. And then you, Kelly, you were critical of the sort of worker's role in the system of Wikipedia and talking about governance. And so I wanted to, maybe to tie into these questions, understand if you think that there is a potential tipping point at which the role of the user worker sort of transforms to steward, particularly given the recent transformation of Wikipedia from digital platform to public digital good, and this sort of new commons language. Like what are the levers or features or functionalities that demonstrate that new modality of ownership, where it's not about working, but it's stewarding, and the potentiality for sort of a multivariate, a pluriversal, I don't know which word to use, sort of understanding of the infrastructure instead of the all-encompassing knowing. So from a universal understanding of knowing and education to the platform across which multiple worldviews are simultaneously true.
All right, 3 very demanding questions. Which one do you want to reply to, and who wants to go first?
Getting over and done with. Wow, that was some whopping questions. So, I'll take the last one since that's the one that I have most to respond to. I think multivocality is possible, and to a certain extent that's happening already across the fact that there's 300 different language Wikipedias. What makes it even more possible is Wikidata and the different types of attribution that's possible with Wikidata. But that's not happening, or it's not happening in a concerted way, because that would need some community buy-in for the idea of multivocality. So yes, things are possible. Yes, alternative ways of expression, alternative worldviews, multivocality are possible across these platforms. But currently, the community that builds it hasn't embraced those ideas of different ways of structuring data. And maybe that can answer some things. You know, all things are possible, but unless there's a group of people organized to push that thing forward, it won't necessarily happen.
I'm not an expert on Wikipedia, but from my perspective, I think we have to be very vigilant about digital idealism, this promise that somehow technology will emancipate us. And I think we need to be very vigilant about the differences between data, information, knowledge and this very old-fashioned Enlightenment concept of critique and critical intelligence. And I think the promise was that data will emancipate us, that information, the more information we have, the less likely we are to fall for ideologies, for propaganda. And this has proven to be, unfortunately, tragically wrong. So I think this promise that access, that if we talk to each other, and this was the promise of digital counterpublics, that if we are able, technology will connect us. This was the promise of Facebook. I was never on Facebook, so the ones who have been on Facebook maybe felt emancipated participating in the digital counterpublics. But I think the lessons we can learn from the last decades is that data will not emancipate us, that information will not emancipate us, that not even knowledge will emancipate us. So let's maybe give this very old-fashioned idea of critique, critical intelligence, self-doubt, self-reflection. I think that was one of the most important also contributions of European Enlightenment, which is why I also say that Europe was the biggest betrayer of Enlightenment, was the idea of self-doubt. The idea, do not accept anything as given without questioning it. And that demands nurturing and fostering of critical questioning, self-reflection, and self-revision also. And I think that's perhaps, I mean, without making any claims, that is perhaps where the hope lies, that we are able to go beyond this kind of fetishization of data, information, and also knowledge.
Two thoughts. One has to do with relations again. And speaking of Glissant, I think that's also another important part of Glissant's philosophy is of the relationality of things. Because I myself have also my own personal kind of hesitations with how the commons, for example, are being constructed, because I think it's so hard to remove it from economic relationships, right? And I think that just to give just another perspective, so this is maybe just giving another perspective to this, that sometimes I am constantly checking as well to what am I being recruited to contribute in what seems to be a knowledge commons, but maybe it is not. So I think there is that angle, like as a person with coming from histories of my ancestors' bodies being violated, I always am wondering to what extent, for example, like this technophilia, for example, of like, oh, if we put everything together, we'll be more democratic. So what I'm saying, for example, is how certain Silicon Valley companies would hire their own hackers to strengthen the system. And that is something as well that I'm thinking a lot about. Like, to what extent am I being hired that my own, the violent history of my body, of my community, can be used as a hacker to strengthen the system? Is that what I want to be? So we need to understand that even as we construct this knowledge, these knowledge systems, there will always be power relationship within that, and all of us will be engaging with it within particular position at it. So that's one. The second one that is I did not discuss in my theory there, that I created this triangulation, the sound, the body, and the sonus. There is something that is called the event, and the event is something that I borrowed from a German philosopher, Joseph Vogel. You probably know him. There's a German word for event. What is the translation for event?
Ereignis, maybe?
Ereignis, yeah. So Ereignis is actually the concept, and there's something that Joseph Vogel beautifully argues that I think that sometimes we miss. We assume that knowledge is just once it's found, it's there. But again, what I was arguing already earlier on, knowledge is already there. But what is missing, based on Joseph Vogel's argument, is an ereignis, a moment, a historical moment when suddenly this knowledge connects us all. And it could be driven by humiliation, possibly. In his case, his main argument is that, for example, there's a particular way that we understand in the 18th century, 17th century, the cosmos. And it is, and there's as part of it that he calls the media agnes, the media event. There is a medium that will be the way that all these events would come together. And he argues that when Galileo Galilei went to the market and saw the Dutch selling the lenses, he took those lenses, assembled them together, pointed it to the sky, and then saw the planets and the moons, and then he started drawing that. So he said, so the argument here is this science of the cosmos is all dependent on all these media, but not just the media. It's dependent on a moment that this media becomes an event, that there's a global moment when we begin to understand the cosmos because somebody, an Italian male body looked through these lenses and then used his hand to draw on paper an understanding of the world, pass it around, and for some reason there was a moment, there's an event that allowed for the world to agree on this through this mediation. And not all the time the media is successful in becoming an event. We could, for example, look at Stravinsky's the first time that he played The Rite of Spring. It was not yet successful. There was no concession. In fact, it was booed. And then years later, suddenly it was the most successful and the most important work. So I think we are missing also an event. Things have already been discovered. Things is already happening. But if there is no event, it does not solidify us as a society in agreeing into something. And it could be indeed, humiliation could do this, for us to shift our minds to that. But there is history in all this. We are laboring, and then we're hoping that history would recognize our labor at some point. But not all the time.
I think we have time for one more very succinct question. If there is one. I see a very timid hand being raised. If no one else wants to go for it, then
through my own interactions, conversation, academic work recently, I've been wondering if we're not at a point of a crisis of imagination. And so I think, I don't remember which one of you brought it up, but it struck something in my brain about the sort of purpose of critique. And I'm wondering if we have entered into an era where critique is no longer enough, and the painting of potential futures is the sort of activity that is required for internalization, for the human to acknowledge their agency so that they're not relegated to a lower caste because they're not able to take action. And so part of my question previously was to try to understand if you have any insights on actual elements for that tipping point, which I think the three of you were each just describing, of we're not there yet. And so moving from, you said fetishization of data, I might say commodification of data, how you don't have an answer maybe, but I would love to try to envision what might be some of those features that actual, instead of it's not this, it can't be that, what could be the sort of forward-looking vision, if I am making any sense, designer.
You are. So there is this, in my perspective, brilliant writer, Adam Phillips, who's written a book called Unforbidden Pleasures. And he says there are certain pleasures that are forbidden. For example, incest. But there are other pleasures which are unforbidden. And he talks about incest and masturbation. He's, of course, drawing on Freud and Lacan. And one of the unforbidden pleasures is self-critique. Because somehow you perform yourself as a modest person. You kind of stage yourself as somebody who's modest in the process that you say, I'm self-critical. I'm able to look at my limits. And this is not just on an individual level, but also for organizations. So I suppose one of the reasons to organize this event is to invite people to say, okay, we as an organization are happy to invite people who will critique us so that we can learn, we can grow. And Adam Phillips argues that self-critique can be very self-indulgent. because it can confirm hegemonic dominant powers. And this is where, again, the ambivalence of Enlightenment comes in, because Enlightenment and Europeans, by weaponizing self-critique, said that we can be self-corrective. That yes, we have committed genocides, we are guilty of slavery, we are guilty of crimes against humanity, but through self-critique we can self-correct, we can self-rectify. And here, critique and self-critique becomes self-indulgent and unforbidden pleasure, and non-performative. So we can assemble here, spend a lot of money, spend a lot of time, and say, how can we do it better? How can we be less capitalist, less imperialist, less exclusionary? And then step out of this room and it's business as usual. So then self-critique is non-performative and self-indulgent. And there then critique is not really a solution and efficient. Critique can, and there are no guarantees here. I mean, again, a wonderful metaphor by Spivak. We all got up in the morning and brushed our teeth. An absolutely futile exercise, because there's no guarantee that we'll survive the day. When we get up in the morning and brush our teeth, there is no guarantee that we'll survive the day. And that is the practice of critique. There is no guarantee that critique will be emancipatory, that it'll be progressive. And yet, we need to nurture and foster this very difficult process in the hope that it will lead to self-doubt, that there will be a moment when we are not self-indulgent and self-satisfied, and maybe we can do things differently.
I think that's a great closing remark. Let's try to carry that self-doubt with us through the day as we collectively engage with the session to come. And last but not least, let's hope that our lunch break is not going to be an unforbidden pleasure. Thank you very much, Kelly, meLê, and Nikita. Thank you for listening and participating. And I'm looking forward to talking to you throughout the day. Thanks.